Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending the second Cooperative Forestry Research Unit webinar of the year. I'm Stephen Dunham, and I'm the Interim Research and Communications Coordinator for the CFRU. For those of you not familiar with the CFRU, we are a stakeholder-driven research cooperative housed at the University of Maine. We have over 30 member organizations, which include forest landowners, wood processors, conservation organizations, and other stakeholders who collectively represent more than 8 million acres of Maine's forests. The CFRU is a core research program in the Center for Research on Sustainable Forests at the University of Maine. This webinar is approved for one Category 1 CFV credit through the Society of American Foresters. If you would like to get credit for this webinar, please fill out the questionnaire that I will be sending you following this webinar as soon as you can. You will notice that you are all muted. This is intentional, and we would appreciate it if you would leave yourselves muted so that you can feel free to type loudly, talk, or eat without us hearing you. Feel free to type your questions there for speakers at any time, but I will read through these questions at the end during our Q&A session. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please indicate that when you type your question. Today's webinar will review current and emerging concepts of mixedwood management in light of an uncertain future, with highlights from a 50-year study of mixedwood productivity following biomass harvesting and prescribed burning, the longest study of its type in the world. I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Dr. Laura Kenefic, Research Forester and Principal Silviculturist, and Dr. Bethany Munoz Delgado, Research Ecologist, both with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. We will now start with Laura's presentation on current and emerging concepts in mixedwood management, and so without further ado, I will turn it over to Laura.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Laura Kenefic. Our presentation today will include both the review of the concepts of mixedwood stands and their management, as well as new findings from a long-term Forest Service study of the effects of whole tree harvesting and prescribed burning in northern mixedwoods. As Forest Service scientists, Bethany and I work on the Mixedwood Ecology and Management team in the Northern Forest Science and Applications Work Unit. Our research is primarily in Maine, but extends to the Lake States and central hardwood regions of the U.S. The webinar will be in two parts. First, I will discuss mixedwood stand dynamics and management considerations. Next, Bethany will present her findings related to mixedwood productivity following biomass harvesting and prescribed burning. All right, before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to just mention that in addition to our Forest Service research team, which is Mixedwood Ecology and Management, Bethany and I are part of a mixedwood management initiative. So we're working with folks from the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, the Quebec Ministry of Forests, Parks and Wildlife, and universities in New Brunswick, Maine, Vermont, New York, and Missouri to investigate mixedwoods across a broader region. Okay, so here we go. Before we go about the details of my technical presentation, I want to just take a minute to acknowledge some folks who've made important contributions to the presentation today. That includes particularly Patricia Raymond from the Quebec Ministry, Josh Pulik from the University of Maine, and Peter Smollich and Brett Chedsoy from Cornell University. I also received contributions, which you'll see here, from Lauren Grenstrom, Ralph Nyland, Dave McLean, and Keith Kennody. I want to start by defining mixedwoods. We define mixedwoods as stands in which neither component, softwoods nor hardwoods, exceeds 75 to 80% of basal area. So these are common in the temperate forests of northeastern North America, and some examples here in Maine include spruce or cedar mixed with fir, maple, birch, and aspen, white pine in mixture with red oak or red maple, or hemlock in mixture with maple, beech, and birch. For discussion today, I will focus on mixedwoods within the natural range of red spruce. This is an ecotone between the eastern broadleaf and boreal forests and is called the Acadian forest. The region is topographically diverse due to the action of glaciers and has highly variable soil drainage, site quality, and abundant year-round precipitation. Though we've historically called the northern conifer forests of this region spruce fir, they're actually mixed species. In New England, many spruce fir stands have some proportion of northern white cedar, eastern hemlock, eastern white pine, and occasional other softwoods like larch or red pine. The key characteristics of most of the dominant conifers are their shade tolerance, slow growth, and a reliance on advanced regeneration. In all cases, proportions of individual species and of the hardwoods in general are a function of climate, site, and disturbance history. The hardwoods in the northern hardwood forest type include yellow and paper birch, red and sugar maple, American beech, aspen species, ash, and others. So when we talk about mixed woods within the range of red spruce, the basis for our understanding is the work of Forest Service scientist Marinus Westfeldt, who worked from the 1920s to the 1950s in New England. And there's a picture of him on the bottom left. He classified the forest into two general types, and this is within the conifer-dominated forest. These included dominant softwood sites, which due to their topographic position, parent material, or drainage, had softwoods predominantly. Secondary softwood sites, in turn, had both hardwoods and softwoods, and they were supported in his model by mid-slope positions. Mixed woods result from the combined effects of site and disturbance regime, which in the forest in question includes small-scale gap-based disturbances with periodic larger-scale disturbance events, which Bethany will discuss later in the webinar. The level of disturbance, available regeneration source, and site influence the amount of hardwoods that are found in stands that would otherwise be dominated by softwoods. Natural disturbance dynamics, such as the mortality of fir in mixed wood stands, can cause species composition in this region to cycle between softwoods, mixed woods, and hardwoods. A notable driver of this dynamic is the spruce budworm, which is a native defoliator with cyclical outbreaks, currently causing widespread defoliation north of us in Quebec. And we are seeing some spruce budworms showing up in pheromone traps here in Maine. In addition to site and natural disturbances, mixed woods result from harvesting that creates regeneration niches for hardwoods in stands that are otherwise dominated by softwoods. So for example, many former spruce fir stands in northern New England are mixed woods today due to the repeated harvesting of softwoods that allowed proliferation of sprouting red maple, aspen, and birch. We see the effects of this forest use history in the FIA data. So this is a graph that shows growing stock volume over time, ranging from the mid-20th century until just a few years ago. And what we see is that starting in the 1980s, during the budworm salvage era, when there was heavy cutting of the softwood resource, there was a reduction in the spruce fir growing stock and a corresponding increase in hardwoods, which is driven in large part by red maple. This map shows the outcome of that in terms of forest type classification. So here's a map from 1960, and then a comparable map that was made for us showing the forest types in 2009. And so what we see is due to the increase in hardwoods and the reduction in softwoods across the state, we've seen a corresponding increase in the maple beech birch group in areas that were previously dominated by both spruce fir, which is shown in like the gray blue, and the white red jack pine, which is in the tan. This compositional shift has been supported by cutting practice here in Maine. So partial harvesting is widely conducted on our working forests with mechanized operations. And this can leave more than 20% of stand area and trails. And such conditions aren't favorable to shade-tolerant conifer regeneration and growth due to the tendency of intolerant hardwoods and competing vegetation to come in those large stand openings. In addition to that, the area in Maine forest land that's been pre-commercially thinned is low relative to historical levels. So when our colleagues in Quebec talk about managing mixed woods, they're mostly talking about the stable mixed woods, such as the spruce and yellow birch that would be on Westfeldt's mid-slope positions. In Maine, many mixed woods that we have today are the result of historical harvesting that removes softwoods, particularly spruce. So these are what I would call transitional mixed woods, meaning that they have a mixed wood composition now, but they're really what we would consider a softwood site and would move to softwoods over the long term in the absence of management. So here we see a nice example of that. This is the same stand from the Penobscot Experimental Forest. There's a picture in 1956 indicating spruce, fir, and hemlock composition, and a photo today following repeated partial harvesting that removed those softwoods, and we've left red maple, birch, and aspen predominantly of sprout origin. So given this context, why manage for mixed woods? Well, perhaps even more so than other species mixtures, mixed woods are thought to confer benefits, including resilience to insects, disease, and climate change. Some have higher productivity, especially if you add softwoods like white pine to hardwood stand. Also in Maine and Quebec, it's been shown that hardwood form improvements can result from stratified mixtures when they're grown with softwoods. Hardwood softwood mixtures also increase market adaptability and flexibility of the wood supply. And there's evidence that these mixtures confer spruce budworm resistance and provide unique wildlife habitat features. However, managing for mixed wood requires considerations of silvical properties of often competing species. We need to create microsites for both shade-tolerant and intolerant species in the same stand, which can be difficult if a uniform treatment is applied. There are difficulties regenerating some of the desired species, such as spruce, due to narrow regeneration requirements and slow growth relative to competitors. And then finally, you can have a proliferation of sprouting species following harvesting. This could include beech or red maple. And if those are diseased or of poor quality, they can negatively impact a mixed wood stand. Other considerations include the species present relative to the desired species, as many are common in our Maine forests and not all have similar desirability. Quality and vigor, or what I would call acceptable growing stock, are important factors to weigh when deciding whether an existing stand should be managed to perpetuate its mixed wood composition. For example, the sprout clump, red maple, gray birch, aspen, pin cherry stand here on the top photo is perhaps not as desirable in the long term as the spruce, yellow birch stand on the bottom, at least when we consider saw timber production. I want to show some data here that were compiled by Marvin of the University of Maine. Marvin is doing a 65-year assessment of the outcomes of the silvicultural treatments on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, looking at both the commodity production and non-commodity aspects of the current stand conditions and their changes over time. So here she has two graphs. This is price per cord on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And the left graph shows saw timber stumpage prices in Maine for common species, and on the right we see pulpwood stumpage prices. Now, saw timber prices have generally increased over time, although there have been some changes in relative value, notably for aspen, which is the gray line, and red maple, which is the orange. So those have increased in relative value. When we look at pulpwood, however, there's a different story. These prices are more variable, with a marked reduction in the spruce fir in recent years. You see that in the green line, it like takes a dive after 2010, and an increase for hardwoods and cedar, which is shown in the yellow and the orange. So as prices for softwood pulp have dropped and hardwood pulp have increased, stands that were managed for softwood pulp production for many years could be a liability to a forest landowner due to the lack of markets. So having a mixed wood composition is perhaps a forestry solution to putting all your eggs in one basket. That leads us to the principles of mixed wood silviculture, which was identified as a specific subject of research in Quebec as early as the 1990s and in the 2000s by the US Forest Service. The idea is to develop silvicultural treatments to grow species in mixture because neither the softwood nor hardwood-oriented systems are well suited for mixed woods. So as an example, we see here in a photo from Patricia Raymond, a mixed pre-commercial thinning that was developed by Marcel Prévost in Quebec. Our work on mixedwoods suggests that regeneration and recruitment are critical stages of mixedwood stand dynamics. Relative species abundance in established stands can be modified through intermediate treatments such as thinning, but the long-term stability of a mixedwood composition requires that we both establish and release new trees of species that sometimes have markedly different silvical properties. So because of this, and regardless of forest type, when we look across the northeastern US, eastern Canada, and the central and lake states of the US, we see that many mixedwood stands transition to hardwood dominance over time. To prevent this, we must control establishment, early growth, and recruitment of the limiting species, which here in the Acadian forest tend to be red spruce or yellow birch. The mode of regeneration is important to consider. Unless the desired species is a sprouter, available seed and a receptive seedbed are required, or planting, usually of larger stock in light of competition, might be needed. With regard to regeneration microclimate, mixedwood stands often comprise species with different shade and light requirements. A spatially homogeneous treatment such as single tree selection or uniform shelterwood is unlikely to meet the needs of both desired softwood and hardwood species if their silvical properties differ. For this reason, partial cutting such as irregular shelterwood or group selection might be appropriate. Some of my colleagues in the Canadian Forest Service and at FP Innovations have been testing the application of multiple treatment silviculture, where you would have 2 or 3 within stand prescriptions such as thinning or release that are applied by the operators based on the conditions they encounter in the field. And they've had success with that with training and frequent feedback between the forester and the operator. Regeneration substrate is also a concern. Our work at the Penobscot Experimental Forest in central Maine, where Bethany's project is conducted, showed that spruce and hemlock regeneration are positively associated with deadwood and negatively associated with hardwood litter, while fir and red maple didn't differ between those two substrates. So we see an example here of there's some spruce seedlings in a line that had regenerated on a downed log that became decayed. So the reason is that the smaller seeds and slower growing and less competitive species benefit from moisture holding substrates such as deadwood or mineral soils that can prevent desiccation until their roots are well established. In managed stands, there's a long-term tendency to reduce decaying wood. That's because the point of our management is to capture mortality. We also see an increase in mid-tolerant and sprouting hardwoods with repeated partial cutting. Once this happens, regeneration of the conifers other than fir can become problematic if they aren't already established as advanced regeneration. So the first priority at the time of regeneration cut is to protect established seedlings of the desired species. Otherwise, a stand might benefit from scarification, either passive due to the passage of machinery or deliberately done with the felling head or other equipment. Once trees are established, competition control is often needed in mixedwoods to overcome what we call the recruitment bottleneck, wherein competition from faster growing tree species and competing shrubs slows the growth of desired species and prevents them from reaching the merchantable size at an acceptable rate. When the desired trees are hardwoods, release from slower growing conifers is generally not required, as the stands will naturally stratify over time. So here's a graph from work by my colleague Josh Kulik at the University of Maine, and it shows crop tree height after within stratum pre-commercial thinning. So this was 10 years following the treatment. This was a mixedwood stand, and what we see is that the hardwood crop trees are stratified above the softwood crop trees. Retaining softwoods in a stand where crop trees can prove advantageous is an approach that should be considered when applying pre-commercial treatments. So in thinning of hardwoods, whether you're doing mechanical or chemical release, taking away those that are competing within the same stratum. So the trees that have crowns at the same level and those that are above it, but not removing softwoods that are in a lower stratum is sufficient. So we found that when doing this, not only was there a favorable growth response in terms of the crop tree diameter and height increment, but that those that had softwood trees in a lower stratum had fewer epicormics. Stand-wide, following pre-commercial thinning in a mixed wood stand, the proportion of the hardwood trees, the portion of the tree, that corresponded to the first piece of boltwood or saw log plus trim tended to be free of epicormic branches. So even if there were epicormics, they weren't on the lower portion of the tree where most of the value is held. Overall, we found that with the presence of softwoods, that there were fewer epicormics as long as the trees were of good vigor and free of damage. So in addition to mechanical release, forest land managers in our region have long used herbicides to release desired softwoods from hardwood competition. Within the context of mixed woods, if you're trying to retain both hardwoods and softwoods, can have a challenge with regard to susceptibility of the species. So you have to think about using the appropriate method, chemical, and rate to limit impacts to the species that you haven't targeted. So commonly used are glyphosate or triclopyr. Application via a backpack sprayer or cut stump could be used for a more targeted approach depending on the species of tree or shrub that you desire to move. So this could be competing hardwoods, this could be shrubs, non-native invasive species as well. So adjustments to the herbicide rate and surfactant concentration have been shown to affect species susceptibility. So Andrew Nelson, when he was here in Maine working with the CFRU, proposed this approach to remove beech and striped maple with less effect on sugar maple. And I've put the link to his manuscript here. It's available online. Deer moose and hare can cause regeneration failures or seriously damage future crop trees at high population levels, and this can be important if you're trying to maintain a mixed wood composition. So here are results of a regeneration survey that we did on the Penobscot experimental forest, and that is northern conifers with many stands in a mixed wood status at this time. We see that among the common softwoods and hardwoods, red spruce, white ash, and paper birch, which are among our preferred species, were the most heavily browsed relative to the other species in the stand. So the red spruce is being browsed by hare, and the white ash and yellow birch were being browsed by deer. In the meantime, and this is sort of interesting, those which we prefer less for future saw timber potential, so namely the balsam fir, which is at the top of the table, and the red maple, which is primarily of stump sprout origin on our forest, had very low rates of browsing, so close to 5%. And so this is something to be concerned about, I think, with regard to our expectations for future stand composition. There are some ideas about using slash or associational resistance, which is growing a tree species you care about with other species around it that aren't so heavily browsed as means to limit the effects of browsing, and that's something that will be looked at in part by the new study CFRU has funded with Nicole Rogers at University of Maine for Kent. So I will mention, just as a point of interest, a research project that's underway at Cornell University in New York, the Arno Forest, where they're using 10-foot wide, 10-foot tall walls of slash and low-grade wood to create a perimeter around a harvested stand. So this is done with logging slash, also with competing understory, particularly beech. They'll run a hot saw during the operation and then use a grapple skidder or excavator to pile it and create this wall around the stand. So at this point, this is experimental. They're finding an average cost of about $1.48 per running foot. And if you'd like more information, Peter Smallage and Brett Chedzoy have information posted online through the Cornell Forest Connect website. Given the long history of harvesting in spruce mixedwoods and the conversion of many former softwood sites through repeated partial harvesting, landowners often find themselves confronted with understocked mixedwood stands of undesirable species or poor quality trees. As a result, rehabilitation silviculture has arisen as a means to restore production potential to degraded stands. So examples, if you have commercial operability, include seed tree or irregular shelter wood with retention of a low density of residuals, site preparation to improve the regeneration substrate and remove competitors, or pre-commercial treatments, which we showed earlier, such as weeding or even enrichment planting. We've done some experimental application of this in a mixed wood stand, and we found that when you do pre-commercial intervention, the per acre costs come in at about $200 per acre for a crop tree release and go up from there if you look at removing all undesirable growing stock and planting. What we found is the crop tree release alone seems to result in a positive growth response and improvements in species composition. With regard to emerging strategies, I would be remiss not to mention ecological forestry as a contemporary management approach for both commodity and non-commodity production. So this recognizes the intrinsic value of the ecosystem and balances commodity production with biodiversity objectives. So these silvicultural systems are inspired by natural disturbance dynamics, and those of you who are in Maine have probably seen this at the Penobscot Experimental Forest, where Bob Seymour has a number of installations of what he calls the Acadian Famelschlag. This is always also being practiced in Quebec, where they are investigating as well a hybrid single tree group selection approach to achieve similar objectives. And up there they found from a continuous cover irregular shelter wood, and for those of you who are not well versed in the variants of irregular shelter wood, there's a really excellent journal article by Patricia Raymond and others in the Journal of Forestry that explains that. That and any other citations I've mentioned that you don't catch, please email me. I'm happy to send you. Anyway, they have some 5-year results from an application of that low intensity, a 30% cut every 25 to 30 years. And they have found good results as far as yellow birch and red spruce regeneration. In addition, we have to think about adaptation to climate change, and this involves the use of silvicultural tools to help forests adapt to an uncertain climate future by increasing resistance to disturbance, promoting diversity and complexity to maximize resilience, and facilitating adaptation to new conditions. So we know that there is an adaptive silviculture for climate change study in northern hardwoods now at the Dartmouth College grant in New Hampshire, and in Quebec, Patricia and others are doing some assisted migration work. So that is quite new, and we're looking forward to see the outcomes of that in the future. But with, as well as I spoke about commodity production and changing markets, there's uncertainty there, and there is as well with the future climate. And so within this context, the idea that we might be able to manage for mixed woods in order to have diversity and resilience is one that I think is worth considering. So with that, I now want to turn the presentation over to my colleague Bethany Munoz, who will share with us the results of a long-term study that she is leading.
Hear me? I am kind of to present on some slides. Hopefully everybody can hear me. All right, we're adjusting the microphone now. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and present on some long-term results looking at site and stand productivity following biomass harvesting as well as prescribed burning in the Penobscot Experimental Forest. These stands are of mixed wood composition, and this is following the harvest. Prior to any treatment, these stands are actually conifer dominated. So as Laura mentioned, we have the occurrence of mixed wood stands, which here I'm actually defining as a spruce fir hardwood mixture. And these stands that changed from conifer to mixedwood were likely as a result of management practices. And because disturbance is a little bit on the heavier side of things, we're going to start to see more of those shade intolerant and sprouting hardwood species that Laura referred to on this site. So just giving you an overview of what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to give some background on the study. So there was a study before we did this study, of which we repurposed in 2013 and 14. We've since reharvested based on the original study design. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to present on these second rotation findings following the reharvest, not only looking at what regenerated back, but also looking at the fuel's deadwood structure that resulted. Because prescribed burning is involved, we wanted to take this opportunity to look at how effective those prescribed burns were. And of course, I wanted to include why does any of this research matter, as well as present some opportunities for future work. So the Penobscot Experimental Forest, it's located in Bradley, Maine, and it's unique in that it has both northern conifer and northern hardwood species present. And this is likely due to the location of the PEF, so I'm going to call the Penobscot Experimental Forest the PEF from here on out, the location of this falling within a transition zone. So I believe it's Janet McMahon who had done some work back in the 1980s where she plotted out the species ranges of multiple tree species and found that there's this kind of convergence where you see the southernmost and the northernmost ranges of species kind of come together. And so as a result, that's where we start to see some mixed wood species composition start to occur. In terms of disturbance history out on the PEF, little is known. However, up until the late 1800s, we kind of found out that it was subject to a few partial harvesting up until that time. So the site on which this occurred, as I mentioned at the beginning, was actually conifer dominated before any kind of treatment. So let's kind of narrow in on what this site actually looks like. So C33, or what we've endearingly called compartment 33, is our study site. It is a strip cut in which anything over 1.3 meters in height, or 4.5 feet in height, were removed. However, they were moved in different ways. So as you can see on the map, there's these strips or these rows with different abbreviations and multiple orders. We carried out a whole tree harvest, a stem only harvest, and a stem only harvest with burning. However, when the study was originally designed, each of these treatments were called something else. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the history. So this study was initiated by Bob Frank. You can see him smiling in the right-hand corner. This was probably taken sometime in the 70s, I'm not sure. But this study was initiated in 1964, 1965, and was described as a strip width / disposal treatment. And so those treatments I mentioned earlier, so they carried out a stem only harvest and a whole tree harvest, they actually called those / left, / removed, and / left and burn. So what makes this study unique is that they were performing what we call today a whole tree harvest before whole tree harvesting was widely conceptualized, and this started to more or less pick up speed in the 1970s. So the original goal, I forgot to mention on the previous slide, of this study was to look at the response of spruce fir to each of these / disposal treatments. But what did they find after the harvest? Well, as Laura mentioned, because this was a little on the heavy side, we started to see more of this hardwood dominance occurring, womp womp. And they even published about this in 1968. Another thing they mentioned, which I thought was interesting, was that they saw more exposure of mineral soil in whole tree harvest treatment than in the burning treatment, which will have some implications for what we found later on. So the study eventually closed in the 1980s, and with it, a lot of monumental features kind of disappeared over time. However, with a little bit of detective work, aka GIS, we were able to find some interesting patterns in how rebar, which was left behind, were laid out, and we were able to rebuild the study in 2013 and 14. And once we were able to reopen it, we wanted to spin it, repurpose it to address something different. So that's where we come up with these questions. So we wanted to start out looking at the stand level. So how did the species composition, the stand structure, and even the carbon stocks, looking all above ground, how did that all look 50 years later on this site across these three treatments? So the whole tree, the stem only, and the stem only with the prescribed burning. And then we wanted to also go a step further and see if there are maybe species-specific differences in these treatments. So let's go ahead and jump into the findings. So the site, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, was described as spruce fir. So about 50% of the stand before it was harvested was actually spruce fir. But altogether, maybe about 75% of the stand were actually conifers. And only 25% of the stand were actually considered to be hardwood composition. However, at the time of our study in 2014-15, the stand was better described as northern mixedwood. So we see that decrease from spruce fir composition to about 36%, and this increase in hardwood composition to about 60%. So what does this look like? So I'm gonna try to click through this. I have some animations on here that will help explain the graphs. So on the graph on the left, we looked at hardwood composition as a percent of total hardwood basal area. So compared to softwood composition, how much of this stand was actually hardwood composition. And then we put on the x-axis treatment. So we wanted to see how much hardwood composition was in each treatment. So we see that dominance of hardwoods across all treatments, but the most of which is pronounced in our burn treatment. So getting into more of our species-specific findings, and again, this is looking at species-specific basal area as a percent of total basal area. In this case, we found that eastern white pine was the only species that had significant differences. And then we saw that even though it was present in low numbers, the whole tree harvest had the greatest amount or abundance of eastern white pine in terms of basal area. However, regardless of species compositional differences, we found no differences in long-term stand structure or carbon stock across any of these treatments 50 years later. So just to summarize, and this is getting into our key take-home messages. So we found that neither whole tree harvest or the burn treatment were found to degrade long-term site or stand productivity 50 years later. However, we did find some compositional differences, particularly starting with our burning. We found that burning after clear cutting significantly increases the hardwood component of these northern mixedwood stands. And so this is where we start to attribute this possibly to maybe loss of our softwood advanced regeneration or seed source. And then going into the species-specific differences, as we found, and this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, that because maybe there was a little more scarification on that site or greater exposure of mineral soil on those whole tree harvests, we likely saw that increase in eastern white pine composition on those treatments. So good news, this work is published, hooray. If you would like more information, please either email me, I'd love to hear from you, or visit the tree search section of the Forest Service website. This publication should be available to all. So moving on to the next chapter of compartment 33. In February to March of last year, we carried out the reharvest. We've made a little upgrade to our equipment that we used since the 1960s. In the 1960s, compartment 33 was entirely manually felled with skidding by a John Deere tractor of some kind. It took them 6 months to do it. Here, we only did it in 1 month with a feller buncher, grapple skidder, and inwood stroke delimber. We like to take selfies on the PEF, so I was really happy that day when I saw this happen. So in September, we were able to carry out a late growing season burn, so following up on those prescribed burn treatments. Before we move forward, we carried about 9 prescribed burns, ranging from 0.1 hectare to 0.4 hectares, depending on the strip width. So, as I mentioned in the beginning when we were discussing the overview, we had some new research questions. So not only did we want to look at what's regenerating back, we wanted to take this opportunity to look at the fuel's deadwood structure across these treatments. So is there maybe a difference in how the fuels are occurring in each of these treatments? So this was a rare opportunity to look at prescribed burning in northern mixedwood stands. So how we did this, we measured fuel loadings, which is essentially just breaking up those woody pieces into size classes, starting from our fine woody material to our coarse woody material. We also wanted to look at the fuel height. So how high are our slash piles following harvest and the burn? We also wanted to look at the litter and duff depth, or just the forest litter layer and the organic horizon. And we also wanted to look at visually how much area was actually burned. Spruce fir and some northern mixedwood stand types are kind of dubbed the asbestos forest. So we want to see visually how much area is actually burned. And then of course we wanted to look at the tree regeneration, starting about 15 centimeters in height to less than 1.3 centimeters in diameter. So what did we find? Visually, we see that across our 9 prescribed burn areas, about 89% of the area actually appeared burned. So again, I start to think back, how much of this is actually an asbestos forest? Oops. Okay, so getting into our total fuel loading, what did we find? Well, across the treatments, the whole tree harvest had the lowest total fuel loading, so the lowest amount of fuels, and this is across all size classes. But let's look as to what might be contributing to that low amount. So from the top and then going down left and to the right, I've gone from our fine woody material to our coarse woody material. And if you look at the coarse woody material, so starting from that 2.5 centimeter mark to greater than 7.6 centimeters, you see that the whole tree harvest did an excellent job of removing those larger woody pieces. However, if you look up at the top at our finer material, or what we call 1 hour size classes, the burn did an excellent job of reducing that finer material, which is a little more readily able to catch fire and spread than those larger pieces. And again, which is likely evidenced by the lower coarse woody material in the whole tree harvest, we also see lower fuel heights. And then looking at the litter and duff depth, you see we had quite a bit of variability across all of our treatments. But nonetheless, we see lower litter and duff in the burn treatment. So let's look at the regeneration. So in 2014 and 15, so this is before the harvest, we see a greater abundance of that softwood advanced regeneration occurring. However, when you look after the harvest, so in 2018, however, this is before the burn. We haven't gone in yet and measured regeneration after the burn yet. We see that increase in hardwood species. So similar to what we were seeing in the 1960s, we're seeing again here in 2018. We see that increase in hardwood dominance. Another thing to note is that the softwood advanced regeneration has decreased as compared to prior to harvest, and this could be just due to operational constraints. Go ahead. So how does that softwood composition and hardwood composition break down? So in 2014, we see that that softwood advanced regeneration was dominated mostly by balsam fir. However, after the harvest, but before the burn, as I mentioned, we saw that increase in hardwood species. Most of those were dominated by a sprouting species, AKA aspen in this case. So just to summarize, let's start with the first treatment. These are the findings from 2014-15, so following the first harvest but before the second harvest. We found no evidence of reduced stand productivity on either whole tree harvesting or the burn treatment relative to our stem-only harvest. We did see a shift in species composition starting from that conifer dominance that we saw before the harvest to more of this hardwood dominance after the harvest. The greatest of which we saw in the burn treatment, which could have been due to loss of our softwood advanced regeneration or seed source just getting burned up. And then we saw a species-specific difference looking at eastern white pine and whole tree harvest treatments, and this could have been due to maybe that scarification or greater exposure of mineral soil that they saw in the 1960s on these treatments. And then bringing everybody up to date on to 2018, so this is following the second treatment. We saw a range of fuel loadings from about 18.4 metric tons with the whole tree harvest to about 51.8 metric tons with our stem-only harvest. So the lowest of those total fuel loadings we saw in the whole tree harvest, which were likely due to less coarser material in that treatment. However, the burn treatment was found to have lower, finer fuels, which are more readily to burn. As seen in the 1960s, we also observed a greater increase in hardwood regeneration. So as Laura and I both discussed, because this was a heavier treatment, we started to see more of those shade-intolerant sprouting hardwood species. So why does any of this matter? So in 2012, a survey went out in which they found that about 53% of all harvests were actually tree length, but 80% of the timber production was actually associated with whole tree harvesting. And so just to put this study on the scale, a study went out by Westfeldt et al. In 2011, looking at evaluations of site and stand productivity following whole tree harvesting and stem-only harvesting. So putting compartment 33 on that scale, you see that compartment 33 has the longest evaluation of whole tree harvesting in temperate forests worldwide. And this is also putting us in comparison to another great biomass harvesting study in Maine, located at Weymouth Point. I believe they're at about 38 years, but they have some excellent findings, and I encourage you to look up some more research on them. But just to put us on the scale, we are the longest evaluation of whole tree harvesting. So looking at the relevance of the burn treatments, a lot of this work was done by Bob Seymour, Tim Fahey, Allison Dibble. It's been well researched that the spruce fir and some northern mixedwood stand types aren't as well influenced by fire as other stand types. And this is going to increase up into the thousands of years on the fire return interval scale, depending on the size and severity of the disturbance. So where this got me thinking was that given recent projections for Maine to have these longer and warmer summers, I start to ask, what is this going to mean for disturbance regimes, particularly with fire? Why I ask is, if you look in the right-hand corner, this is actually taken from one of the prescribed burns that occurred on compartment 33. again, I go back to the asbestos forest concept. I know I said that a lot, but what I'm starting to see is these forests will readily burn even within a few months at following harvest if given an ignition source. So opportunities for future work. We did collect plant available nutrients in the soils, and we also looked at the foliar nutrient content on red maple and balsam fir in 2014 and 15, so following the first treatment. So we're working on getting those results published. And then we also collected soils and plant available nutrients in 2018, and we're working on that data as well. This summer, we're going to go ahead and go back in, collect that 1 year post-harvest and burn follow-up measurements. So just to look at that residual stand 1 year following all these treatments. That's all I had, but both Laura and I will go ahead and take questions.
All right. Thank you, Bethany, and thank you, Laura. And thank you all for bearing with us. We had a few minor technical difficulties. So it looks like we only have one question in the chat so far. So again, just a reminder that if you would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat. And so Ernest Carl asks, what is the relevance of prescribed burning for the majority of landowners who will never use or see it? I believe this is for Bethany.
So, and Laura, you can chime in at any time here. The relevance of this would be to either investigate the effects of, for example, tick populations. There has been an increase in wanting to see if maybe prescribed burning reduces tick populations, which will have implications for wildlife. There's also the question of what would you like to regenerate back? Obviously, this gets into more market-specific questions of which I am beyond capable of answering, but that is how I would address that question. Laura, did you have any follow-up?
No, I think that's sufficient, Bethany. I mean, I would also add that, you know, though we recognize that many landowners would not be pursuing prescribed burning as a treatment, we do have some partners in the region that are doing that and are interested in it. So I think what we're learning here will be helpful to us going forward.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So if anyone, I am allowing people to unmute themselves for the folks on the telephone that won't be able to enter. So if anyone else has any questions, you could, and you're on a phone, you could unmute yourself and ask it. We have a question from Nalbert. Taro, any ideas about the effect of prescribed burning on beech?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't have any beech in this stand. I'm not sure how much more I can offer on that insight, but my guess is if beech loves disturbance, depending on how severe the fire is, it might sprout back readily, but that would be my assumption.
Awesome. Any other questions from the audience? From Julia Burton, in the interpretation of the effects of whole tree harvesting on white pine, for example, increasing due to scarification, inconsistent with the decrease observed in the burn treatment?
Let's see.
I don't think so. And I mean, I'll defer to you, Bethany, with your expertise. I think what Julia's asking here is that, so we saw an increase in white pine following the whole tree harvesting, which we attributed to exposure of mineral soil. So I guess she's asking, is that inconsistent with the fact that we didn't see more white pine in the burn treatment, perhaps with the idea that it would expose mineral soil as well? I guess we're not sure, not having those data from the 1960s treatment. I would think that depending on the source of the seed, whether it was, you know, when it came onto the site. It's possible that if there were small seedlings or seed, that it got destroyed in the burn. But I guess not having the details of what was going on with the seed crop and the effect of the burn at that time, it's hard to say. I will say, and Bethany, you can chime in on this, but my recollection from Bob Frank is that the burn at that time was a pile-in burn and not a broadcast burn, so it might not have had the stand-wide effect. Is that possible?
Yep, so that is possible. It could have just been how they piled and burned. There might have been a lot of slash. They did find in that publication that I showed up on that slide that there wasn't a lot of exposure mineral soil. So another thing that Bob recollected from those burns was that it took them, I think, at least twice to burn some of these treatments. So maybe there wasn't a very effective burn being carried out at that time.
That could be.
Does that answer your question? Sorry, I was struggling. Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions? Just a note from Patricia. Thank you very much, ladies, for this interesting webinar.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thanks, Patricia.
All right, folks, not seeing any more questions rolling in, and we're getting towards the end. I'll let everyone get back to their busy days. So thank you for attending our webinar today. If you would like to get credit for this webinar, please check your email in the next day or two for the form that you need to fill out in order to get this credit, and we hope you join us next time. You do have a final question that rolled in from Alex. George, is there any reason for changed species composition due to whole tree harvest?
Any reason for change in species composition? Are we looking at the hardwood or the stand level or the species specific? In this case, we didn't see any difference in hardwood composition between the stem-only harvest and the stem-only harvest itself. The prescribed burn treatment was the only one that had the greatest hardwood composition and significantly different than either whole tree harvesting or stem-only harvesting. But there were no differences seen between whole tree harvesting and your bolt-only harvest. And as I mentioned and what we discussed with Julia, in response to Julia's question, we likely saw maybe that increase in eastern white pine, probably due to whatever they were doing operationally in the 1960s. Unfortunately, we can't know for sure if that was what happened.
I think this gets to the microclimates and the seed source that were available for regeneration. So with regard to the sprouting species, I wouldn't really expect a difference from whole tree harvest or stem-only harvest. I would think that with the whole tree harvest, as you mentioned, greater potential for scarification. And there also was likely some low shade effect from residues where they weren't taken off the site. So I think those are things that might contribute to possible species differences.
I hope that answered your question.
And just so everyone knows, the recording of this webinar will be available on the CFRU website, as well as the slides that were presented today. And it's now just about 3 o'clock, so we will bring this to a close. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.